You actually came." Those were the first words I said to my Uncle Rafferty as he walked toward me across the empty parking lot outside the engineering building, his worn leather shoes crunching on the gravel, his old suit jacket flapping in the spring breeze. I was still wearing my cap and gown, still holding my diploma, still standing in the spot where my family should have been waiting to congratulate me. They were not there. They had not been there for the ceremony either. The seats I had reserved for them, for seats in the third row, with their names written on little cards I had made myself, had remained empty throughout the entire 2-hour graduation. I had walked across the stage, shaken the dean's hand, accepted my diploma with honors, and looked out at an audience that did not include a single person who shared my last name. Except now there was Rafferty, walking toward me with that familiar lopsided smile, the uncle my family never talked about, the man they called the black sheep, the disgrace, the cautionary tale of what happens when you cross the Mercers. "Would not have missed it for the world, kid," he said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like coffee and old books. "Summa cum laude in mechanical engineering. Your grandfather would have been proud as hell." I held on to that hug longer than I probably should have, this unexpected comfort from the one relative who had bothered to show up. When I finally pulled back, I could feel tears burning in my eyes, and I blinked them away furiously. I was 21 years old. I was not going to cry in a parking lot, because my family had abandoned me. "How did you even know about the graduation?" I asked. "I did not think anyone told you about family stuff anymore." "They do not, but I have my ways." He winked at me, then his expression grew serious. "I also know where they are right now, Dashiell. I know why they are not here." My stomach clenched. "Where are they?" "The Worthington estate. Your brother got engaged last night to Tinsley Worthington, and apparently that is more important than watching you graduate. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Dashiell Mercer, though everyone calls me Dash. I was 21 years old when I graduated from State University with a degree in mechanical engineering, a 3.97 GPA, and the bitter knowledge that no matter what I achieved, I would never be enough for my family. But to understand why I ended up standing in an empty parking lot with the uncle everyone pretended did not exist, you need to understand the Mercer family hierarchy. My father, Prescott Mercer, was the CEO of Mercer Construction, one of the largest construction companies in the tri-state area. We built office buildings, shopping centers, hospitals, schools. If there was a major construction project within 200 miles, chances were good that Mercer Construction was involved. My father loved to talk about how he had built the company from nothing, how he had started with a single truck and a dream, how everything we had was the result of his hard work and vision. My mother, Cordelia, was the perfect executive's wife. She hosted dinner parties for my father's business associates, organized charity galas that got written up in the society pages, and maintained a home that looked like something out of Architectural Digest. She was beautiful and polished, and completely devoted to the Mercer image, the carefully constructed facade that my father presented to the world. And then there was my brother Bryce. Bryce was 2 years younger than me, but you would never know it from the way my parents treated him. From the moment he was born, he was the golden child, the favorite, the one who could do no wrong. I remember the exact moment I realized this, standing in the doorway of the nursery when I was 4 years old, watching my mother coo over my baby brother like he was the most precious thing in the universe. She had never looked at me that way. She never would. Where I was awkward and studious, Bryce was charming and athletic. He had our father's easy smile and our mother's blue eyes and a natural charisma that made everyone adore him. Teachers who gave me B's gave Bryce A's for the same work. Coaches who cut me from teams recruited Bryce personally. Girls who ignored me fell over themselves to get Bryce's attention. It was like we were living in two different worlds, his bathed in golden light and mine cast in permanent shadow. where I spent my weekends studying in my room and working whatever job I could find to save money for college. Bryce spent his partying with friends and dating a string of increasingly wealthy girlfriends. He wrecked 2 cars before he was 18, both of which my parents replaced without complaint. He got suspended from school for cheating, and my parents blamed the teacher for being unfair. He dropped out of college twice before finally graduating, and my parents praised him for finding his path. Where I had to fight for every scrap of attention, Bryce received adoration simply for existing. He was the sun, and I was just a distant planet, cold and dark, and forever orbiting something that would never warm me. The disparity was obvious from childhood. When I brought home straight A's, my parents nodded and said, "That is nice, Dashiell," before turning back to whatever they were doing. When Bryce brought home C's, they hired expensive tutors and praised him for trying his best and took him out for ice cream to celebrate his improvement. When I won the state science fair with a project on sustainable energy that had taken me 6 months to complete, my parents forgot to attend the ceremony. I stood on that stage alone, accepting my trophy while looking at 2 empty seats in the front row. When I got home, my mother asked if I had remembered to pick up milk from the store. When Bryce scored the winning goal in a junior varsity soccer game, a game that meant nothing in the grand scheme of anything, my parents threw him a party that lasted all weekend. They invited all his friends and their families, catered food from an expensive restaurant, and spent the entire time telling everyone who would listen how talented their son was. I learned early that there was no competing with Bryce. He was the sun, and I was just a distant planet, cold and dark, and forever orbiting something that would never warm me. When it came time for college, the difference became impossible to ignore. My parents announced that they would pay for Bryce's education in full, covering tuition, room and board, spending money, everything. He could go wherever he wanted, study whatever he liked, take as long as he needed. Money was no object when it came to their precious younger son. For me, the offer was different. They would pay for 2 years at a community college, they said, and then I was on my own. If I wanted to transfer to a 4-year university, I would have to figure out how to pay for it myself. They simply could not afford to put 2 children through expensive private schools, my mother explained, and since Bryce had more potential, it made sense to invest in his future. I was 16 years old when they told me this, sitting at the dinner table while Bryce smirked into his mashed potatoes, and something inside me hardened into stone. Fine, I thought. I will do it myself. I will prove that I do not need them. I will become more successful than Bryce could ever dream of being, and I will do it without a penny of their help. I threw myself into my studies with a fury that surprised even me. I graduated high school as valedictorian, giving a speech to an auditorium that did not include my parents because they were at Bryce's basketball banquet across town. I earned a full scholarship to community college, where I took the maximum course load every semester and worked part-time at a fast food restaurant to pay for books and transportation. Then I transferred to State University with enough financial aid and student loans to cover most of my expenses. What the aid did not cover, I earned myself, working 30 hours a week at a warehouse loading trucks and stacking pallets while maintaining a near-perfect GPA in one of the most demanding engineering programs in the state. For 5 years, I lived on 4 hours of sleep and cheap ramen noodles. I studied on my breaks at work, sitting in the loading dock with a textbook balanced on my knees, memorizing equations while forklifts beeped around me. I did homework on the bus, typing problem sets on a laptop, so old it had to be plugged in constantly because the battery no longer held a charge. I sacrificed every social opportunity, every friendship, every relationship that might distract me from my goal. While Bryce was partying at his expensive private school, joining a fraternity, and going to football games, and taking spring break trips to Cancun, I was grinding myself into dust. While he was changing majors 3 times because he could not decide if he wanted to study business or communications or sports management, I was pulling all-nighters in the engineering lab, running simulations and checking calculations until my eyes burned. While he was taking 6 years to graduate with a gentleman's C average, I was earning recognition from my professors and recruiters from top companies. I told myself it would be worth it. I told myself that one day, all my sacrifices would pay off, that my family would finally see what I had accomplished and recognize my value. I imagined the look on my father's face when I walked across that graduation stage, summa cum laude, job offers in hand, living proof that I did not need their help or their money or their approval. I was a fool to think they would care, but I succeeded. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree that would open doors Bryce could not even imagine. I had job offers from 3 different engineering firms, each one more prestigious than the last. I had done everything right, achieved everything I set out to achieve, and I had done it entirely on my own. But none of that mattered to my family, because Bryce had gotten engaged to Tinsley Worthington. The Worthingtons were old money, the kind of family that had portraits of their ancestors hanging in museums and buildings named after them at Ivy League universities. Tinsley was their only daughter, a pretty, vapid blonde who had never worked a day in her life and never would. Her trust fund was worth more than my father's entire company, and when Bryce started dating her 6 months ago, my parents acted like he had won the lottery, because in their minds, he had. Marriage to Tinsley meant access to Worthington money, Worthington connections, Worthington status. It meant the Mercer family would finally be elevated to the social stratosphere they had always aspired to. It meant my father could stop pretending to be self-made and start rubbing shoulders with the genuine aristocracy. Compared to all that, what was a graduation? I found out later that Bryce had proposed the night before my ceremony at a dinner party hosted by Tinsley's parents at their estate. My parents had been invited, of course, and when the engagement was announced, the Worthingtons had insisted on an impromptu celebration that lasted until 3 in the morning. The next day, while I was walking across the stage to receive my diploma, my family was sleeping off champagne hangovers in guest rooms that cost more per night than my apartment cost per month. They had not even texted me an apology, not a single word. I was still standing in that parking lot, processing this information, when Uncle Rafferty put his hand on my shoulder. "I know that look," he said quietly. "That is the look of someone who has just realized their family will never love them the way they deserve to be loved. I wore that look myself, about 20 years ago." What happened 20 years ago? Rafferty smiled, but there was no humor in it. "That is a long story, and I think it is time you heard it, but not here." He glanced around the empty lot. "Do you have somewhere we can talk? Somewhere private?" We went to my apartment, a tiny studio in a run-down building near the warehouse where I worked. It was not much to look at, just a bed, a desk, a hot plate, and a bathroom the size of a closet, but it was mine. I had paid for every inch of it with my own money, and I was proud of that, even if I was embarrassed to show it to anyone. Rafferty did not seem to notice the peeling paint or the stained carpet. He sat down on my one chair, set his briefcase on the desk, and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was serious and sad and something else, something that looked almost like hope. "What do you know about me, he asked. "What has your father told you?" I thought about it. The truth was, my father rarely mentioned Rafferty at all. When he did, it was always in vague, dismissive terms. Rafferty was a loser, a failure, someone who had squandered every opportunity and ended up with nothing. He was not to be trusted, not to be contacted, not to be acknowledged at family gatherings. He was, for all intents and purposes, dead to the Mercer family. "Not much," I admitted. Dad always said you made bad decisions and that we should not associate with you." Rafferty laughed bitterly. "Bad decisions. That is rich, coming from Prescott." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Let me tell you what really happened, Dash. Let me tell you the truth about your father and the company he claims to have built from nothing." For the next 2 hours, my uncle told me a story that turned everything I knew about my family upside down. 25 years ago, Rafferty and Prescott were partners. They had started Mercer Construction together, pooling their savings from years of working odd jobs, combining their skills and their dreams into something that might actually succeed. But even then, the brothers were different. Rafferty was the visionary, the one who saw possibilities where others saw obstacles. Prescott was the cautious one, the one who worried about risk and reward and what might go wrong. They worked side by side in those early days, building the company from the ground up. They laid bricks together, poured concrete together, climbed scaffolding together. They shared a tiny office in a strip mall and split a single salary that barely covered their rent. They were brothers in every sense of the word, bound not just by blood, but by a shared dream of building something that would last. But it was Rafferty, not Prescott, who had the vision. It was Rafferty who landed the first big contracts, staying up all night preparing proposals, driving hundreds of miles to meet with potential clients, charming his way into opportunities that should have gone to larger, more established firms. It was Rafferty who developed the relationships with banks and suppliers, learning their languages, understanding their needs, building trust through years of reliable partnership. It was Rafferty who put in the 18-hour days, who showed up first and left last, who took on every challenge with the certainty that hard work would be rewarded. Prescott, meanwhile, handled the books. He stayed in the office, managing payroll and accounts receivable and the endless paperwork that came with running a growing business. He was good at it, organized and detail-oriented, but he resented every moment. He resented Rafferty's success, his ease with people, his ability to make things happen through sheer force of personality. He resented being the silent partner, the one no one remembered, the one who stayed behind while his brother got all the glory. For 5 years, they built something remarkable. The company grew from 2 brothers with a truck to a legitimate operation with dozens of employees and millions in revenue. They bought their first office building. They expanded into new markets. They started winning contracts that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. And then, 20 years ago, Rafferty was in a car accident. It was bad. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit him broadside, crushing his pelvis and shattering his left leg. He was in the hospital for 3 months, in rehabilitation for another 6. During that time, he was completely unable to work, unable to even visit the office, unable to do anything but focus on learning to walk again. And during that time, Prescott made his move. He forged my signature on documents transferring my shares to him, Rafferty said, his voice steady but his hands trembling with old rage. He told the bank I had agreed to step back from the business due to my injuries. He told our clients I was retiring. He told everyone a story, and because I was stuck in a hospital bed, I could not contradict him. "But surely you could have fought it," I said. "You could have gone to court, shown that the signatures were forged." "I tried. God, I tried." Rafferty shook his head. "But your father was smart. He waited until I was on heavy pain medication. Then he visited me in the hospital with a stack of papers. He said they were get-well cards from the employees, asked me to sign them so he could hang them in the office. I was so drugged I could barely see straight. I signed whatever he put in front of me." He opened the folder and spread documents across my desk. Bank statements, contracts, corporate filings, medical records. 20 years of evidence, meticulously collected, carefully preserved. Those signatures he collected were used to create a baseline. His forger practiced until he could replicate my handwriting perfectly. By the time I got out of the hospital and realized what had happened, it was too late. The company was his. Everything we had built together was gone. Why did you not go to the police? I did, but Prescott had covered his tracks too well. The signatures looked authentic. The documents were properly filed. And your father, well, he had spent those months building relationships with the right people. Local politicians, police officials, judges. By the time I tried to fight back, the deck was stacked against me. I stared at the documents, trying to process what I was hearing. My father, the man who lectured me about hard work and integrity, the man who claimed to have built his empire from nothing, was a thief and a fraud. Everything I had been told about his success was a lie. Everything I had been denied, the tuition money, the parental support, the basic acknowledgement of my existence, had been funded by wealth that was stolen from the man sitting in front of me. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Why today of all days? Because today you became an adult in a way that matters, Rafferty said. Not legally, you have been an adult for years, but emotionally, spiritually. Today you graduated from one of the best engineering programs in the country, and your family did not even bother to show up. Today you finally saw them for who they really are. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. And because I have spent 20 years preparing for this moment, 20 years gathering evidence, building a case, waiting for the right time to strike. I could not do it alone. I needed someone on the inside, someone who understood the family, someone your father would never suspect. You want me to help you take the company back. I want us to take it back together. The company should have been your inheritance, as much as mine. Instead, your father gave everything to Bryce, the son who has never worked for anything in his life, while you struggled and sacrificed and got nothing in return. Rafferty's voice hardened. It is time to balance the scales, It is time for your father to pay for what he did to both of us. I should have hesitated. I should have asked more questions, demanded more proof, taken time to think about what I was being asked to do. But all I could see were those empty seats at my graduation. All I could feel was the weight of 5 years of exhaustion and loneliness and being told I was not good enough. All I could hear was my mother's voice, explaining that they simply could not afford to invest in both children, and since Bryce had more potential, what do you need me to do? I asked. Over the next 3 months, Rafferty and I planned the downfall of my father with the precision of a military campaign. Rafferty had spent 2 decades building his case, but he needed one final piece of evidence, something that would prove beyond any doubt that the original documents had been forged. And that evidence was in my father's office, in a safe that Rafferty knew existed but had never been able to access. Prescott is arrogant, Rafferty explained during one of our late-night planning sessions. He kept everything. The original forged documents, the records of payments to the forger, even the practice sheets where the signatures were perfected. He thinks he is untouchable, that no one would ever dare to challenge him. That arrogance will be his undoing. My job was to get access to that safe. As Prescott's son, I could visit the family home without raising suspicion. I could find opportunities to be alone in his office. I could search for the combination, copy the documents, and deliver them to Rafferty's lawyer without anyone knowing what I had done. It was harder than I expected. My father was paranoid about his office, keeping it locked whenever he was not inside, never letting anyone else enter without supervision. But I was patient, and I was motivated, and eventually I found my opening. It came during Bryce's engagement party, a lavish affair hosted at the Worthington estate 3 weeks after my graduation. The entire Mercer family was required to attend, even me. the forgotten son who had not received so much as a congratulations text after walking across the stage. My parents wanted to present a united front, a perfect family ready to merge with Worthington royalty. I smiled and shook hands and pretended to be happy for my brother, all while watching and waiting for my moment. It came near the end of the evening, when my father received a phone call about some emergency at a job site and had to leave the party early. My mother stayed behind to maintain appearances, and I volunteered to drive myself home, claiming a headache. Instead of going home, I went to the Mercer construction offices. I had a key given to me years ago during a brief period when my father thought he might groom me to take over the business. That idea had lasted about 6 months before Bryce expressed a passing interest in the company, at which point my father forgot I existed and started training his preferred heir. But he had never asked for the key back, probably because he had forgotten he had given it to me. The office was dark and empty, the security guard long since sent home for the night. I made my way through the reception area, past the cubicles where administrative staff worked during the day, down the hallway lined with photographs of completed projects, buildings my father claimed to have built from vision and hard work. I knew now that every one of those buildings represented stolen success, a legacy built on the ruins of his brother's dreams. I reached my father's corner office, the one with the mahogany desk and the leather chairs and the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. My hands were trembling as I unlocked the door with my old key, half expecting an alarm to sound, half expecting my father to be sitting there in the dark, waiting for me. The office was empty. I closed the door behind me and began searching for the safe. I found it behind a portrait of my grandfather, the man who had apparently been the only decent Mercer in living memory. The portrait showed him as a young man, probably around my age, with the same dark hair and serious expression that I saw in my own mirror every morning. I wondered what he would think of what his sons had become, one a thief and the other a victim, the family he had raised torn apart by greed and betrayal. The safe was old-fashioned, a combination lock that required 3 numbers to open. I had no idea what the combination was, but Rafferty had given me a list of possibilities based on significant dates and numbers in our family history. Birthdays, anniversaries, the date the company was founded, the date my parents got married. The first combination I tried did not work. My father's birthday, my mother's birthday, and their wedding anniversary. The dial spun, the handle turned, but the door stayed firmly shut. The second combination failed as well. The date of Bryce's birth, the date of my birth, and the date Prescott had officially taken control of the company. Nothing. The third combination I tried worked. My father's birthday, my mother's birthday, and the date Mercer Construction was officially incorporated, the date that marked the beginning of his stolen empire. The dial clicked, the handle turned, and the heavy steel door swung open with a sound that seemed deafening in the silent office. Arrogance and sentimentality, a predictable combination. My father thought he was so clever, so untouchable, that he had never imagined anyone would ever try to open this safe. Inside, I found everything Rafferty had said I would find. Folders full of documents, some yellowed with age, others more recent. Practice sheets covered with attempts at Rafferty's signature, each one slightly better than the last. Bank records showing payments to someone identified only as consultant in amounts that matched the forger's fees Rafferty had described. And most damning of all, the original forged documents themselves, the ones that had transferred Rafferty's shares to my father, complete with signatures that I could now see were subtly different from my uncle's actual handwriting. I photographed everything, my hands trembling with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Then I closed the safe, rehung the portrait, and drove to Rafferty's apartment to deliver the evidence. We had him. After 20 years of waiting, we finally had enough to prove what Prescott Mercer had done. But Rafferty did not want to go to the authorities just yet. He had waited 2 decades for this moment, and he wanted to make it count. He wanted to destroy my father not just legally, but socially, publicly, in front of everyone who had ever believed the lies. "The wedding," he said, looking at me with that fierce light in his eyes. "We do it at Bryce's wedding. Maximum humiliation, maximum audience, maximum impact." Bryce and Tinsley's wedding was scheduled for September, a massive affair that had been planned by a team of professional coordinators and would cost more than most people earned in a decade. 300 guests, a string quartet, a 12-piece band, flowers flown in from Holland, a dress that had been custom designed in Paris. It was going to be the social event of the year, the crowning achievement of the Mercer family's long climb toward respectability. It was also going to be the stage for their complete destruction. The day of the wedding dawned bright and clear, a perfect autumn afternoon with golden light filtering through the trees and a gentle breeze that made the leaves dance and flutter to the ground. The ceremony was being held at the Worthington estate, a sprawling property that had been in their family for 6 generations, complete with manicured gardens, a private lake, and a mansion that made our house look like a shed. The garden where the ceremony would take place had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale. White chairs were arranged in perfect rows, each one decorated with silk ribbons and fresh flowers. An arch covered in white roses marked the spot where Bryce and Tinsley would exchange their vows. String lights had been hung in the trees, waiting to twinkle to life once the sun went down. It must have cost a fortune, more money than most people would see in a lifetime, spent on a single afternoon. I arrived early, dressed in the expensive suit my mother had insisted on buying me, the one concession to my existence that she had made during the entire wedding planning process. She had taken me to a tailor, a real tailor who measured me and adjusted the fabric and made sure everything fit perfectly. It was the most attention she had paid me in years, and I knew it was only because she did not want me to embarrass the family in front of the Worthingtons. I smiled at relatives and shook hands with strangers and pretended to be happy for my brother, all while watching and waiting for my moment. I made small talk with distant cousins I had not seen in years, listened to aunts and uncles praise Bryce for his good fortune, nodded along as my father's business associates congratulated him on the merger of 2 great families. No one asked about my graduation. No one mentioned my degree or my job offers or my summa cum laude honors. As far as anyone knew, I was just the older brother, the quiet one, the one who had never quite lived up to the Mercer name. It came near the end of the evening, when my father received a phone call about some emergency at a job site and had to leave the party early. My mother stayed behind to maintain appearances, and I volunteered to drive myself home, claiming a headache from the champagne. Rafferty arrived separately, slipping into the back of the crowd just as the ceremony was about to begin. He was not on the guest list, of course, but in a gathering this size, one more middle-aged man in a suit was easy to overlook. He caught my eye from across the garden and gave me a small nod. The ceremony was beautiful, I suppose, if you cared about that sort of thing. Bryce and Tinsley exchanged vows under an arch covered in white roses. They kissed while 300 people applauded. They walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, showered in rose petals thrown by flower girls in matching dresses. Then everyone moved to the reception tent for dinner and dancing, and that was when we made our move. My father stood up to give his toast, champagne glass in hand, beaming at the crowd with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally achieved everything he had ever wanted. His younger son was married to an heiress. His company was thriving. His reputation was spotless, or so he thought. He was, in his own mind, untouchable, the king of his own domain, surrounded by admirers who validated every lie he had ever told. "I want to thank the Worthington family for welcoming us so warmly," he began, his voice carrying across the silent tent with the practiced ease of a man who had given many speeches. "Your generosity, your grace, your willingness to embrace our family as your own, it means more than I can express. And I want to thank my son Bryce for making this old man so proud." He paused, looking at Bryce and Tinsley sitting at the head table, the picture of young love and privilege. "Everything I have built, everything I have achieved, has been for my family. And seeing my son marry such a wonderful woman, knowing that the Mercer legacy will continue into the next generation, well, there is no greater joy a father can feel." "Actually," said a voice from the back of the tent, "I think there is something you forgot to mention." The murmur that had been building in the crowd went silent. Heads turned. My father's face went pale as Rafferty walked forward, cutting through the crowd of stunned wedding guests like a ship through still water. People stepped aside as he passed, sensing instinctively that something significant was about to happen. I rose from my seat and followed him, my heart pounding, but my resolve firm. This was the moment we had planned for, the moment Rafferty had waited 20 years to see. Whatever happened next, there was no going back. "Rafferty," my father said, his voice strained, his smile frozen on his face. "What are you doing here? You were not invited. This is a private family event." "Family? Is that what we are calling it now?" Rafferty reached my father's table and stood there, looking down at his brother, with 2 decades of rage simmering just beneath the surface. "I am your brother, Prescott. Your older brother. The one you stabbed in the back and left for dead. Does that not make me family? You need to leave. Now, before I have security remove you. I think your guests might want to hear what I have to say first." Rafferty turned to address the crowd, 300 pairs of eyes staring at him in confusion and alarm. Some of them knew who he was, the black sheep of the Mercer family, the cautionary tale about failure and bitterness. They expected him to make a scene, to embarrass himself, to prove everything Prescott had ever said about him. They were about to learn how wrong they were. "My name is Rafferty Mercer. I am Prescott's older brother. And 20 years ago, while I was lying in a hospital bed, recovering from a car accident that nearly killed me, my dear brother forged my signature on documents that transferred my ownership of Mercer Construction to himself. He stole my company, my life's work, everything I had built with my own hands. And he has spent the last 2 decades pretending to be a self-made man while I lived in poverty and disgrace." A murmur rippled through the crowd, louder now, shocked gasps and whispered questions. My mother rose from her seat, her face twisted with fury, her champagne glass trembling in her hand. "This is ridiculous. Rafferty is delusional. He has always been jealous of Prescott's success." "Success?" Rafferty laughed. "Is that what you call it? Let me tell you about your husband's success. Cordelia. Let me tell you how he forged my signature on documents while I was drugged in a hospital bed. Let me tell you about the payments he made to a professional forger, the evidence he kept in his safe like trophies, the 20 years of lies that built this empire of fraud." "You have no proof," my father said, but his voice was shaking now. "This is slander. I will sue you for everything you are worth." "Actually, he does have proof." I stepped forward, my heart pounding. "I found it myself in your office safe. The forged documents, the payment records, the practice sheets. Everything." My father stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "Dashiell, you were involved in this. You missed my graduation to celebrate Bryce's engagement. You spent my entire childhood telling me I was not worth investing in. You built your fortune on theft and then acted like you were some kind of self-made success story. I pulled the folder from inside my jacket and threw it on the table in front of him. These are copies. The originals are with a lawyer who is filing criminal charges against you as we speak. The tent erupted into chaos. Guests were shouting, demanding explanations. The Worthingtons were conferring urgently, their faces a mixture of horror and fury. My mother was screaming at Rafferty, calling him a liar, while my father sat frozen, staring at the folder like it was a bomb about to explode. And Bryce, my perfect golden brother, the favorite son who had never wanted for anything, was standing at the head table watching his wedding day disintegrate around him. "This is insane," he said, his voice cracking. "Dad, tell them it is not true. Tell them Rafferty is lying." But my father said nothing. He just sat there, silent and pale, the fight draining out of him as the weight of 2 decades of deception finally came crashing down. The rest of the wedding was a disaster, of course. The Worthingtons withdrew to confer with their lawyers, and within an hour, there were rumors that they were already planning an annulment. Guests fled like rats from a sinking ship, eager to distance themselves from the scandal that would dominate social gossip for months. My mother had to be helped to her car, sobbing hysterically, while my father was escorted away by police officers who had arrived in response to the charges Rafferty's lawyer had filed. Through it all, I stood with my uncle, watching the destruction of the family that had never really been mine. I should have felt guilty, I suppose. I had helped destroy my father, my mother, my brother. I had ruined a wedding and shattered a family and exposed secrets that were never meant to be revealed. But all I felt was relief. The weight I had carried my entire life, the burden of being the forgotten son, the overlooked child, the one who was never good enough, lifted from my shoulders as I watched my father led away in handcuffs. I was finally free. The aftermath took years to fully unfold. My father was charged with fraud, forgery, and theft, a laundry list of crimes that painted a picture of systematic deception spanning 2 decades. The trial was a media sensation, covered by newspapers and television stations across the region. The story of the self-made businessman who had stolen everything from his own brother was too juicy to resist, and reporters descended on our family like vultures on carrion. My father fought the charges at first, hiring the best lawyers money could buy, claiming that Rafferty was a bitter failure, trying to steal his success through the courts. But the evidence was overwhelming. The forged signatures, analyzed by handwriting experts, were clearly not Rafferty's. The payment records showed a clear trail to a known document forger who had since been imprisoned for other crimes. The medical records proved that Rafferty had been on heavy pain medication during the time he had supposedly agreed to transfer his shares. One by one, my father's lies crumbled. His lawyers withdrew from the case, unwilling to continue representing a client whose guilt was so obvious. His business associates distanced themselves, afraid of being tainted by association. His friends disappeared, fair-weather companions who had only been interested in his success, not his friendship. Eventually, he pleaded guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. Standing in that courtroom, wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of his expensive suits, he looked small and old and defeated. He did not look at me as the judge pronounced his sentence. He had not looked at me since the wedding, since the moment I had thrown that folder on the table and revealed myself as his enemy. He was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, though with good behavior he might be out in 5. It was not enough. Not really. Not for 20 years of stolen life and ruined dreams. But it was something. The company was dissolved, its assets liquidated to pay restitution to Rafferty and settle the countless lawsuits that followed the revelation of my father's crimes. Former employees filed suits for unpaid wages. Suppliers demanded payment for outstanding invoices. Banks called in loans that had been secured with fraudulent documentation. By the time everything was settled, there was nothing left of the empire my father had built on lies. Rafferty received a substantial settlement, not enough to replace what he had lost, not enough to give him back the 20 years that had been stolen from him, but enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life. He bought a small house in the countryside with a garden and a workshop where he could build things with his hands the way he used to before the accident. He seemed at peace. Finally, the weight of injustice lifted from his shoulders. My mother divorced my father while he was awaiting trial, claiming she had known nothing about his crimes, that she was as much a victim as anyone. No one believed her, but she managed to salvage enough of her social standing to avoid complete ruin. She moved to Florida and remarried within a year to a retired dentist who had no idea about her past. Bryce's marriage lasted exactly 3 months. The Worthingtons pushed for an annulment as soon as the scandal broke, and Tinsley was only too happy to comply. My brother was left with nothing. No wife, no inheritance, no prospects. Last I heard, he was working as a personal trainer at a gym in Arizona, far from the life of luxury he had always expected. And me? I took one of those engineering job offers, the one at the prestigious firm in Chicago, 300 miles away from everything I had known. I moved to a new city where no one knew the Mercer name, started a new life where I was judged on my own merits rather than my family's reputation. I worked hard, the way I had always worked hard, but now the work brought rewards instead of resentment. Within 2 years, I was leading my own projects. Within 4, I was being recruited by larger firms, offered positions that would have seemed like fantasies when I was eating ramen noodles in my tiny apartment. I built a career based on my own talents and hard work, and every success was sweeter because I had earned it honestly, without theft or deception or the destruction of someone else's dreams. Rafferty and I stayed close, meeting for dinner whenever I was in town, talking on the phone every Sunday, building the relationship we should have had all along. He told me stories about my grandfather, about the early days of the company, about what it had felt like to watch his brother's betrayal unfold while he was helpless to stop it. I told him about my childhood, about the years of being overlooked and undervalued, about the determination that had driven me to succeed despite my family's indifference. We were alike in many ways, my uncle and I. Both of us had been cast aside by the Mercer family, judged unworthy of love or support or basic human decency. Both of us had been told we would never amount to anything, that we were failures, that we did not deserve the good things that came to others so easily. And both of us had proved them wrong, building lives of meaning and purpose from the ashes of what they had tried to destroy. He came to my wedding 3 years later, when I married a woman I met at work, a fellow engineer named Rosalind, who loved me for who I was and not what I could give her. She was brilliant and kind and completely unimpressed by money or status, the opposite of everyone my family had ever valued. She knew my whole story, every ugly detail, and she loved me anyway. Rafferty stood in the front row and cried when I said my vows. This uncle who had been cast out and forgotten, finally welcomed back into a family that deserved him. He gave a toast at the reception that had everyone laughing and crying, talking about second chances and found family and the importance of never giving up on the people who matter. It was the wedding my father's money could never have bought. Small, intimate, filled with people who genuinely cared about us. No society reporters, no expensive flowers, no 300 guests pretending to be happy for a couple they barely knew. Just love, real and honest and hard-won. Sometimes I think about my father sitting in his prison cell, and I wonder if he ever thinks about what he lost. Not the company or the money or the status. Those things he could have rebuilt if he had been willing to work for them honestly. But his family, his brother, who would have shared everything with him if he had just been willing to share in return. his sons, who might have loved him if he had given them the chance. I imagine him lying on his narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling, replaying the choices that had led him to this place. The first forged signature, the first stolen payment, the first lie that had seemed so small and had grown into something monstrous. I imagine him wondering if it was worth it, if the years of luxury had been worth the years of imprisonment that followed. But then I remember the empty seats at my graduation, the years of being overlooked and undervalued, the casual cruelty of a family that saw me as nothing more than an afterthought. I remember my mother explaining that they simply could not afford to invest in both children, that Bryce had more potential. I remember my father's face when he talked about his self-made success, the pride he took in achievements that belonged to someone else, and I stopped wondering. Some people do not deserve forgiveness. Some people do not deserve forgiveness. Some debts can never be repaid, and some families are better off destroyed. Rafferty told me once that revenge is a dish best served cold, and I suppose he was right. We waited, we planned, we struck at the perfect moment for maximum impact. But the sweetest part of our revenge was not the destruction of my father or the dissolution of his stolen empire. The sweetest part was building something better in its place. A relationship based on honesty instead of lies. A career based on merit instead of theft. A life based on love instead of resentment. My father took everything from his brother and gave nothing to his forgotten son. In the end, all he accomplished was bringing the two of us together. And together, we took it all back. Thank you for listening to my story of growing up faster than I ever wanted to. I have left 2 more stories on your screen, both from young men who learned that sometimes becoming an adult does not happen at 18. It happens the moment your family needs you to be strong. Click on whichever one speaks to you. And if you want to join our community of people who understand what it is like to be forced to grow up overnight, that notification bell is waiting. Until tomorrow, remember, age is just a number, but courage defines who you really are.